African leaders defiant. Stand. Powerful statement. Shocks. Western nations. Stop everything you're doing right now, because I'm about to show you footage that Western media is desperately trying to suppress. A speech so explosive that it literally made French diplomats walk out of international meetings. And a moment so historic that it will be talked about for generations as the day Africa finally said no to Western domination.
10.
My brothers and sisters, what happened 3 days ago in Burkina Faso wasn't just a political statement.
4.
It was a declaration of war
2,
against the neo-colonial
1.
system that has enslaved our continent for over 60 years. Captain Ibrahim Traore, this fearless 35-year-old revolutionary, stood before international cameras and delivered the most devastating takedown of Western hypocrisy that the world has ever witnessed. And the reaction from Washington, Paris, and London has been nothing short of panic mode. I'm talking about grown diplomats having emergency meetings at 3 a.m., international news networks receiving direct orders to downplay the story, and Western leaders scrambling to figure out how to respond to a young African who just exposed their entire playbook to the world. This wasn't some scripted diplomatic speech filled with polite language and empty pleasantries. This was raw, unfiltered truth delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a hurricane that left the international community absolutely stunned. When Captain Traore said, and I quote, "We will no longer accept your conditional friendship that requires us to betray our own people," you could literally see the color drain from Western ambassadors' faces, because they knew their game was finally over. The statement was broadcast live across multiple platforms, translated into dozens of languages, and within hours had been viewed by millions of people across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even in Western countries where citizens are tired of their government's hypocritical foreign policies. What makes this moment even more incredible is that it wasn't delivered from a position of desperation or weakness, but from absolute strength and moral authority that comes from a leader who has consistently put his people first, who has delivered real results, and who has proven that Africa doesn't need Western approval to prosper and thrive. The timing was absolutely perfect, delivered just as Western influence across Africa is collapsing, just as African nations are forming new partnerships with countries that respect their sovereignty, and just as a new generation of African leaders is emerging who refuse to be intimidated by threats or bought with promises of aid that comes with strings attached. The international media immediately went into damage control mode, with CNN, BBC, and France 24 either completely ignoring the story or spinning it as the rantings of an unstable leader. But social media exploded with support from across the global south, as people recognized this as the moment when Africa finally found its voice and decided to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. But here's where this story becomes absolutely fascinating and reveals the true genius of Captain Ibrahim Traore's strategic thinking. This wasn't just an emotional outburst or a moment of anger. This was a carefully calculated message delivered at precisely the right moment to maximum effect, addressing specific Western policies and actions with devastating accuracy and undeniable evidence that left his critics with absolutely no credible response. The captain began by systematically dismantling the myth of Western moral authority, pointing out the glaring contradictions between what Western nations preach about human rights and democracy versus what they actually do when their economic and strategic interests are at stake. Specifically mentioning how these same countries that lecture Africa about governance have supported some of the most brutal dictators in African history, as long as those dictators served Western corporate interests rather than their own people's needs. He provided specific examples that made international observers extremely uncomfortable, naming Western corporations that have extracted billions from African resources while leaving local communities in poverty, identifying international financial institutions whose loan conditions have kept African nations in perpetual debt cycles, and exposing how supposed development aid programs are often just mechanisms for maintaining economic control and political influence over African governments. The economic section of his statement was particularly devastating because he came armed with facts and figures that proved how current international trade relationships are designed to keep Africa as a supplier of raw materials rather than allowing African nations to develop their own industries, add value to their resources, and build sustainable economies that serve their own citizens first. Captain Traore's words on security matters were equally powerful and direct. We reject any military presence on our soil that serves foreign interests, rather than African peace and stability. A statement that sent immediate shockwaves through Western military establishments that have grown comfortable treating Africa as their personal playground for military interventions, proxy wars, and strategic positioning against rival powers. He specifically called out the hypocrisy of countries that destabilize African regions through their interventions and then offer to help solve the problems they created, pointing out that many of Africa's current conflicts can be traced directly to external interference rather than internal African issues. The cultural and psychological dimensions of his message resonated deeply with Africans across the continent who recognized the truth in his words about how Western education systems, media narratives, and international organizations have systematically undermined African confidence and promoted dependency mentalities that convince Africans they cannot succeed without Western guidance and approval. The captain's response to this psychological warfare was uncompromising. We are done apologizing for our success, done seeking permission for our progress, and done accepting the narrative that Africa needs to be saved by anyone other than Africans themselves. The reaction from across the continent has been extraordinary, from university students in Lagos to market women in Dakar, from young professionals in Nairobi to traditional leaders in rural communities. Africans are sharing clips of the speech, discussing its implications for their own countries, and expressing pride in finally having a leader willing to say publicly what they've been thinking privately for years. Other African leaders, while perhaps not ready to make such bold public statements themselves, are quietly incorporating similar themes into their own policy positions and beginning to take more assertive stances in their dealings with Western partners who have grown accustomed to dictating terms rather than negotiating as equals. The statement has become a catalyst for broader discussions about African unity, economic independence, and political sovereignty that are taking place in parliaments, universities, and community centers across the continent, as people begin to imagine what Africa could achieve if it were truly free from external manipulation and control. Perhaps most importantly, this historic moment has inspired a new generation of young Africans who are refusing to accept that their continent's future should be determined by foreign powers, and who are committed to building African solutions based on African values, African priorities, and African leadership that puts the prosperity and dignity of African people at the absolute center of all political and economic decisions for generations to come.